Hello and welcome to the first Alnwick Castle Podcast of 2026. I'm Daniel Watkins.
And I'm Deborah Beecroft.
And for our first episode of the year, we're taking an in-depth look at one of our favourite historical figures from Alnwick Castle's history, Henry Percy, 9th Earl of Northumberland, and better known as the Wizard Earl. We'll take you through his entire life, the key events and people he met along the way, and explain how he got his magical nickname.
The Wizard Earl has been discussed briefly on several other episodes of the Alnwick Castle Podcast, and throughout this episode we'll let you know which ones to listen to if you'd like to find out more. You'll also find a list of these episodes in the show notes.
Here is the story of the Wizard Earl of Northumberland. We hope you enjoy it.
Born at Tynemouth Castle in May 1564, Henry Percy was the son of the 8th Earl of Northumberland. The 8th Earl made sure his son and heir was brought up in the Protestant faith of Elizabethan England. His early education was based in Yorkshire with a clergyman called Thompson.
In his late teens, he was sent abroad for the enlargement of his experience and the improvement of his mind and manners. When he set off, he received a letter of advice for his trip from Lord Burleigh, one of Queen Elizabeth's most important courtiers. Henry wrote back to him from Paris in April 1581, saying, "I am most indebted to you after the Queen and my parents. Thanks for your exquisite and rare counsel and your directions for my travels."
But there were worries that sending the heir to the Earldom of Northumberland into Europe would attract the attention of exiled English Catholics, who were always looking for powerful and high-ranking converts to their cause. Precautions were taken. Elizabeth's agents at foreign courts had been instructed to watch over him and look out for Catholics trying to recruit him.
Religion would be a major theme and a major problem throughout Henry's life. In the mid-1580s, his father was imprisoned in the Tower of London for the third time on suspicion of involvement in Catholic plots, and was found mysteriously dead in his cell. For the full story of the 8th Earl's suspicious death, please listen to episode 45, Strange and Mysterious Alnwick Castle Tales.
We don't know much about how Henry reacted to the news about his father. The only real record is in a letter to Lord Burleigh from one of his spies from several years later, which suggests that Catholics hoped the circumstances of the 8th Earl's death might bring his son over to their side. The letter mentions Henry is in discontent about his father's death and may be seduced to the See of Rome. He does not appear to have ever become a Catholic at any point in his life, but in July 1585, at the age of 21, Henry Percy became the 9th Earl of Northumberland. While Henry had had a good education, it had not really extended to learning how he should manage and look after the land and estates he would inherit. So when he became 9th Earl, he wasn't very well prepared for the responsibilities and the practical duties he would now be in charge of. Decades later, in a document called Instructions to My Son, he wrote about the mistakes of his youth and his wasteful habits, such as hawks, horses, gambling and fine clothes, and blames the lack of proper training. His father had kept him in the dark about family affairs and domestic details, so that he had to trust his officials to help him without really knowing who they were, or how trustworthy they were. Several of them managed to make themselves rich at his expense.
By the 1590s, Henry seems to have got his head around how to run his lands effectively. On the 24th of November 1593, he wrote to his constable at Alnwick Castle, who was called Mr. Fenwick, and complained that the court rolls and records in the north were not being kept properly.
The letter to Fenwick also shows a sense of justice from the 9th Earl. He blames Fenwick for evicting a widowed tenant from her farm, saying, "It was extreme and not according to the customs of the country that she should be expelled. I require that the old woman should be reinstated to her former estate."
He did find favour with Elizabeth I, who made him governor of Tynemouth Castle in 1591, and 2 years later made him a Knight of the Garter. He received an annual New Year gift from her, and gave gifts to the Queen in return. In 1601, he spent £200, £27,500 today, on an embroidered petticoat provided by Lady Walsingham, and a jewel to Her Majesty bought of Mr. Spilman, the Queen's jeweller.
The 1590s also saw the Queen allow him use of Sion House in London, one of several houses in and around the city that he lived in over the course of his life. Sion came into full ownership of the Wizard Earl in the following decade, and it is still owned by the Percy family today. You can hear more about Sion on episodes 10 and 36 of the podcast. Another Percy home in London, in the Blackfriars area, was next to a house later belonging to William Shakespeare and mentioned in his will.
The various problems that the Percy family had had with the Tudor monarchs, including the deaths of Henry's father and uncle, meant that their northern residences, like Alnwick Castle, had fallen into disuse, with many of their contents removed. In Instructions to my son, the Earl wrote, "I came to be an Earl of Northumberland so well left for movables as I was not worth a fire shovel or a pair of tongs. What was left me was waistcoats riveted with nails, for wives commonly are great scratchers after their husband's death if things be loose."
This last part is probably a reference to his mother, Katherine Neville, with whom he did not have a good relationship, and the feeling was mutual. Historian Richard Lomas writes, "He considered her to be a grasping woman who had been too well provided for in widowhood. In return, she considered him to be a wastrel, which in his early years as Earl was true."
In December 1587, Katherine, now remarried after the 8th Earl's mysterious death, had written to Lord Burleigh and said in the letter, "My good lord, I was twice to wait upon your lordship at your house, but could not find your lordship at home, so I am enforced to complain unto you in writing my great disquiet and discomfort. I have long seen the disordered life of my son the Earl. He regards neither parent, friend, nor kinsman, and lacks grace to govern himself like one of his calling. I make unto your lordship my most humble request, that it may please your lordship to be well informed of his manner of life, the readier to judge and see redress of the wrong and disgrace he has done me, and to take some course for correcting his misspendings and misordered life, so as he might hereafter be able to serve the Queen's Majesty and his country, and that I may be put in better assurance of quiet in my own house, growing into years and sickliness, his own mother, whose life he desires to shorten with grief if he cannot do it otherwise."
Katherine died in 1596 at the age of 50. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, though without a memorial or marker, and it is unknown whether her relationship with her son improved as he grew up and became more mature. Throughout his life, the 9th Earl was dismissive of women and their abilities, and these feelings seem to have begun with his mother.
Henry did have an early love of literature. Some of the books he owned in his first years as Earl included a history of Britain known as Holinshed's Chronicles and works by Machiavelli. Other titles include Discourses on War, Offences of the Queen of Scots, and one book just called Anagrams, which were very popular for a time in the 16th century.
We know about these books through surviving records of Henry's personal expenditure. These records tell us a lot about what the 9th Earl was interested in and reveal more about what he was like as a person.
As he got older, he would spend much more money on books, not just purchasing, but also binding and cataloguing them. The most frequently mentioned subjects in the records are architecture, gardening, and military history. He also bought maps, globes, and astrolabes, devices described by Oxford University as multifunctional astronomical instruments that can be used to tell the time, to determine the length of day and night, to simulate the movement of the heavenly bodies, for surveying and for astrological purposes.
The records start to make clear why Henry became known as the Wizard Earl. On one occasion, he purchased a speculative glass, meaning a crystal ball used for reading the future, as well as quicksilver and copper, which were probably ingredients for experiments in alchemy, turning base metal into gold. He was clearly interested in the art of divination and seeing the future. He paid 40 shillings to the demonstrator touching your lordship's great jewel that was stolen, which appears to be a reward for discovering a thief by using clairvoyance.
By 1603, the Wizard Earl had firmly established his reputation as a student of literature and of science, devoting as much time as possible to those pursuits. Sion House had become home to a great library, and the Earl employed agents in Europe to collect rare and valuable books which he could add to his collection. We know the name of one of these agents, a man named Dalrymple, who is mentioned in a 1603 letter as about to travel to France, Germany, and Italy with bookish matters in hand for the Earl of Northumberland.
While he didn't always get on with his fellow aristocrats, the Wizard Earl took every opportunity to be in the company of scholars, from the astronomer Thomas Harriot, who was introduced to him by Sir Walter Raleigh, to the poet Edmund Spenser. He made connections with philosophers, mathematicians, historians, geographers, and physicians. Percy family historian Edward de Fonblanc, writing in the Victorian period, said, "His purse was ever open for the promotion of science, and no poor scholar ever turned disheartened from his doors." But the Wizard Earl did not just spend money on science and study. His records show large payments for tobacco and pipes. Just a few years after his friend Sir Walter Raleigh introduced tobacco to England, Henry became one of the first people in the country to start a fashion for smoking. He also appears to have been a gambling addict. His losses in 1586 to Raleigh and to others totalled nearly £1,000, around £170,000 today.
Other payments include 40 shillings to the French ambassador's cook for instruction to his own cook, another 40 shillings for a licence to eat meat during Lent, and a payment of £18 14 shillings, around £3,000 today, for a pair of popinjay green stockings and 9 pairs of other silk stockings. We know the Wizard Earl was a very fashionable dresser.
The pattern of the Wizard Earl's problems with women continued when he was married. He had been linked to Arbella Stuart, who would have a claim to the throne if Elizabeth I died. As the Earl was also a potential claimant, although with a much weaker claim, a marriage between the two of them would have been politically risky, and it never took place.
Instead, in the mid-1590s, and possibly at Queen Elizabeth's suggestion, a marriage was arranged to Dorothy Devereux. Sister of the Earl of Essex, Dorothy was as strong-willed as her new husband. They both had short, strong tempers, and they clashed frequently. Dorothy, who was considered a very honourable and virtuous lady by many, complained about her marriage in correspondence with courtiers, particularly in regard to the allowance given to her by the Earl. One source noted an occasion when the Lady Northumberland was in court. She spoke with the Queen, complained of the little means she had to live, and besought Her Majesty's favour.
It did not help that she usually publicly took the side of her brother in political matters, while her husband tended not to agree with Essex about anything politically. Both men were proud, ambitious and impulsive, so were always unlikely to get along very well. But after Essex fell out of Elizabeth's favour, Northumberland did try his best to help restore him to the Queen's good side. When Essex went to fight on behalf of the Queen in Ireland, Charles and Richard Percy, 2 of the Earl's brothers, were there too.
By the time Essex led a doomed rebellion against Elizabeth, Henry had distanced himself completely from his brother-in-law. According to historian James Shapiro, the Wizard Earl considered Essex the last rebel against the crown in the tradition of their noble ancestors, the last upstart to wear the crown of England in his heart.
Within 4 years of the marriage, Henry and Dorothy had separated 2 or 3 times, living apart for periods of time, but they did have several children. Their first child, a son, died in infancy in 1597 and was followed by 2 daughters. Another son died young in 1600, before the birth of Algernon, the future 10th Earl of Northumberland, in 1602.
The 9th Earl's political life was centred on attending the royal court in the south of England, but he still had to look after things in the north. He had made Alnwick Castle his main northern residence, but didn't seem inclined to take an active role in running things, at least not in his younger years. In the county of Northumberland, however, raids by border reivers were still happening frequently and causing a lot of destruction. For more on the story of the reivers, please listen to episode 72 of the podcast.
One letter to the Earl from the Warden of the Middlemarches said, "My very good lord, I am sorry I have not to acquaint your lordship with better tidings than these, which necessarily I must now deliver your lordship. On Tuesday before New Year's Day last, the Burns, Youngs and Moores with 27 horses came to your lordship's town by Alnwick called Rugley, and there broke up the doors of 2 of your lordship's tenants, and took from them cattle and horses. They continued in the town 2 hours or thereabouts. The fray came to Alnwick town, the common bell was rung, yet none rose to the aid of your poor tenants, neither in the whole country had they any help."
By 1594, the Earl had appointed a new constable of Alnwick Castle to help sort the problem, his distant cousin Thomas Percy. One of Thomas's first acts as constable was to make sure the tenants of Alnwick were equipped with helmets, shields, pikes and horses so they could defend against Scottish attack. He also had to make sure Alnwick Castle had enough brewing, kindling, horse fodder, bedding and various other supplies. The Earl's reliance on Thomas in the north would cause him significant trouble later in his life.
Despite his early years as a reckless big spender, Henry became an effective land manager, and, among other things, he was one of the first English landlords to commission scientific surveys of his estates, giving him accurate data and detailed knowledge of his land. Plans made for this in 1620 still survive today.
In 1588, the Earl, like several other nobles, hired a ship at his own expense to help fight the threat of the Spanish Armada. 11 years later, in 1599, he was one of several noblemen who raised troops to defend London when there were fears that another Spanish army had landed on the Isle of Wight ahead of an invasion.
As part of the larger war against Spain, a military campaign was launched in the Low Countries at the turn of the 17th century. The Earl of Northumberland travelled there, apparently for the opportunity of witnessing war. A number of young nobles volunteered for military service for this reason. However, it's possible he was also given a secret mission relating to one of Spain's conditions for peace, a demand for concessions on behalf of English Catholics.
Whatever his real purpose, he clearly felt he had to be equipped in a way that suited his rank and position, and was accompanied everywhere by a retinue of servants. His accounts note how much he spent on this. In the Low Countries for 33 weeks in 1600 and 1601, expenses £4,018, 19 shillings, 2 3/4 pence, besides £1,121, 18 shillings and 10 pence for purchase of horses. That's a combined £700,000 in today's money.
As historian Richard Lomas explains, he was very conscious of being an aristocrat, so was very quick to take offence if he thought he was being slighted or demeaned. This is a big reason why he ended up almost fighting a duel with the commander of the English forces, Sir Francis Vere. While it wasn't unusual for nobles to join military campaigns as volunteers, Sir Francis demanded that they were subject to military discipline. The Earl resented this because he didn't believe it was deferential enough to him.
It wasn't the first duel the Wizard Earl had almost found himself in. Back at court, his temper had flared in a matter with Shakespeare's early patron, the Earl of Southampton, who had allegedly spoken negatively about him. Southampton sent Percy an official challenge to duel, but before any fighting could take place, they were both called before the lords at court, who declared that they knew Southampton had not spoken the negative words. Henry Percy told the lords that he believed them. Southampton revoked his challenge, and they made friends.
In the Low Countries, Percy learned that Sir Francis Vere had made negative comments about his character, and this time he was the one who sent a challenge. Sir Francis, meanwhile, had denied any wrongdoing to the Earl's reputation, denied making the comments, and said that the Earl was at fault for believing the people who'd spread the lies. The challenge read, "I hold it proper to call you to account for those wrongs I have heard you had done me. You love to take the air and ride abroad. Appoint, therefore, a place betimed to your own liking, that I may meet you. Bring a friend with you. I will be accompanied with another that shall be witness to the things I will lay to your charge. If you satisfy me, we will be good friends. If not, we will do as God shall put into our minds."
Northumberland demanded a verbal reply, but Sir Francis wrote back to him instead, saying, "If your lordship's meaning be, by the meeting you appoint, to draw a verbal satisfaction from me in the objections you are to make, the manner of the meeting, in my opinion, is not the best. In regard that truth delivered where swords might be drawn, is subject to hard construction, which I desire to avoid. Your lordship shall therefore be pleased to nominate some fit place for communication, whither I will repair with much willingness, to clear myself of having given your honour the first cause of offence, for I despise private combating."
The Earl refused to receive Vere's letter, insisting only on a verbal reply. So Sir Francis consented to meet him at a place of Percy's choosing, with the gentleman attending as a witness. Percy now objected to the gentleman witness, thinking they would inform the Queen in Council, and said he was resolved to deal with Vere in the style of a soldier.
Sir Francis declined these conditions, which meant the Earl was now thoroughly persuaded that he had done him these wrongs which he meant to lay to his charge.
By this time, word of the quarrel had got to Queen Elizabeth's agent for the Low Countries, who did report it to the Queen. Elizabeth commanded Henry not to take any action against Sir Francis, so they never had their duel, but they never made up either. In fact, one source claims that as soon as the Queen died, the Earl took the first chance he could of getting revenge, hitting Vere in front of the whole court in 1603.
We should mention that historians generally agree that Sir Francis was in the right throughout the entire quarrel and the Wizard Earl was in the wrong. Although a pamphlet by English official Thomas Wilson from 1600 names the Ninth Earl in a list of potential successors to Queen Elizabeth, he doesn't appear to have had any great desire to take the crown for himself. It was King James VI of Scotland he seemed to want as king, and it was definitely a king he wanted. After 45 years of Elizabeth as monarch, Henry once said his countrymen were wishing no more queens.
In letters to the Scottish king, he assured James he was the favourite to succeed, telling him, "I hear none almost call it in question at the royal court in England, and guessing the Queen's own wishes by claiming, I think her Majesty in the secret of her heart wish it you before any creature." James had been waiting his whole life to be officially named successor, but Elizabeth refused to do it. The Wizard Earl told James to be patient, advising him, "No one can deny that you are so nigh to by right, and that it cannot be good for you or us that you should seek it sooner by force."
On one occasion in April 1602, Percy pledged himself to James's claim on Elizabeth's throne, on the condition that James would tolerate Catholics once he became king in England. He said, "It were a pity to lose a good kingdom for not tolerating a mass in a corner." James responded with cautious thanks, but warned the Earl not to send more messengers unless it was urgent.
Percy was one of the inner circle of courtiers at the time of Elizabeth's death in 1603, and would have helped to ensure that her successor ended up being James. If nothing else, having the same king on both sides of the border might help reduce the violence that took place so often in the north. For more on the role the Wizard Earl played in the succession, listen to our interview with Tracy Bowman on episode 83, The Stolen Crown.
The new king, who the 9th Earl accompanied into London, made Henry a privy councillor and captain of the gentlemen pensioners, the monarch's bodyguards. His brother Alan Percy was soon made a lieutenant. Henry and Dorothy were godfather and godmother to Princess Mary, the first child born to James and his queen Anne of Denmark, after he succeeded to the English throne. Sion, which he had previously occupied under a lease from Elizabeth, was soon entirely in Percy ownership. But court intrigues and politics soon saw the Earl lose his prominent position in the council, and by 1605 he'd mostly withdrawn from the court, focusing on studying, educating his children, and working on the house and gardens at Sion.
The last time he personally attended on James was on a royal visit to Oxford in August 1605. There he received a Master of Arts degree. The university recognised him as follows: Henry Percy, the most generous Count of Northumberland, a great encourager of learning and learned men, especially mathematicians, who, as others have in a high manner, celebrated his worth.
1605 was a crucial year for the Wizard Earl, as it saw the Gunpowder Plot, in which his cousin and Constable of Alnwick Castle, Thomas Percy, was directly involved. For the full story of Thomas and the Gunpowder Plot, please listen to episode 22 of the podcast.
The Earl's enemies at court directed suspicions about the plot at him. They suspected he was involved, or perhaps even in charge of it. The Earl simply said that none but Thomas can show me as clear as the day or as dark as the night. Only his cousin could fully clear or implicate him, but Thomas was dead, shot in his attempt to escape after Guy Fawkes was discovered on the 5th of November. The evidence against the Earl was circumstantial, but he remained under suspicion. His castles in the north, including Alnwick, were searched under a royal warrant, and formal accusations began to be levelled against him.
The accusations were sending Thomas Percy to King James when he was King of Scotland, stealing away the hearts of his subjects to try and gain favour for English Catholics, known as the most traitorous faction in the kingdom.
Making Thomas a gentleman pensioner, while knowing he was a Catholic, and without confirming he had taken the proper oath for the job.
Having written letters to his officers in the north, while being held under suspicion of involvement in the plot, asking them to look after his money and revenue and make sure it did not reach Thomas Percy. This was seen as giving Thomas a note and watchword to escape.
Writing those letters without getting the king's permission first.
And failing to instruct his northern officers to capture Thomas Percy, so preferring the safety of a little money before the taking of a capital traitor, and consequently before the safety of the king and the whole kingdom.
His trial took place in the Star Chamber on Friday the 27th of June 1606. He was never accused of treason, but the accusations can be summarised as him having knowledge of treason and failing to disclose it.
At the trial, Percy did not deny advising the king to make some concessions for Catholics. He did not deny that he failed to check Thomas's admission to the gentlemen pensioners, and he did not deny writing to his northern agents and warning them not to let any money reach the fleeing Thomas. But he absolutely denied what these facts were being used to imply, that he was guilty of plotting against his king.
Unfortunately for him, he was found guilty. He was removed from the Privy Council as captain of the gentlemen pensioners and from every other office and honour he held. He was ordered to pay a fine of £30,000, a little over £4 million today, and was to be held prisoner at the Tower of London. He would remain there for the next 15 years.
Historians have wondered why he was imprisoned for such a long time. There wasn't any evidence linking him to the plot. He wasn't Catholic. He'd clearly been in favour of James taking the throne, and had been so well rewarded when it happened, it didn't make sense for him to want the plotters to succeed. However, the long history of rebellious Percys would have counted against him. Possibly more importantly, he didn't have the political following and influence to counteract Robert Cecil, later the Earl of Salisbury, an important and powerful courtier hostile to Henry and who became King James's closest advisor.
In a letter to the king dated the 2nd of July 1606, the Earl appealed for justice after his conviction. Henry said he had not had one disloyal or undutiful thought towards the king, and blamed the devilish attempts and ugly acts of a wicked fellow, meaning Thomas. He admitted he had trusted Thomas, but I find to my sorrow he had crafted poison laid up in his breast against your majesty and the state, and unfaithfulness to me. He denied involvement with the gunpowder plotters, and said Thomas hath abused me, in using my name amongst those of his factions, where not so much as any one man was ever known to me. And he pled for forgiveness and freedom from James. Look upon me with eyes of mercy, and you shall raise a faithful subject, that willingly will be ready to sacrifice his life in your service.
It didn't work, but at least Percy had the Queen on his side. Anne of Denmark did not believe he was guilty and advocated to her husband on behalf of the Earl. Perhaps surprisingly given the problems in the early years of their marriage, it was Dorothy, the Countess of Northumberland, who became the biggest advocate for her husband's freedom. She hoped and believed his sentence would be reduced after a sweetening of the king's displeasure had taken place, once his anger had calmed down. The Queen even visited Dorothy at Sion and assured her she was also trying to get through to the king and lower his resentment towards the Earl. Neither woman's attempts had any effect on James.
Henry wrote to the king again in September 1606, but his focus this time was on the enormous fine he had to pay. He said, "It is the greatest fine that ever was got upon any subject in this realm. My estate is not such as perhaps the world takes it for. My debts are greater than is believed, and there is a company of little ones to provide for, which lies upon my hands."
Both the Earl and the Countess kept up their appeals. On one occasion, Dorothy had some success. She was told by King James that if her husband could prove that Thomas Percy had not warned him about the gunpowder plot, James would think about what he could do for him. On the 7th of January 1608, the Earl wrote to the king in response to hearing this update. He said, "It pleased your majesty, amongst other speeches upon the Countess, urging of my innocence, to wish I could prove that Percy gave me no notice, the very main point of my troubles. But your majesty, that is so great a scholar and so judicious, cannot but know how impossible it is to prove a negative."
Dorothy did not give up, having also spent these years appealing to influential courtiers like Robert Cecil, Earl of Salisbury. A 1606 letter by Sir Alan Percy mentions the Countess pleads so hard with Salisbury that he won't see her again.
Alan and the Earl's other brothers were indirectly harmed by Henry's conviction. They were removed from all their royal positions. Meanwhile, his secretary, Dudley Carleton, was kept under close watch for several months and then excluded from serving in any other noble households. He told the Wizard Earl that the gates of the court are now closed to all connected with your lordship.
Henry was now facing a reduced income, greater financial burdens, and larger debts. He also still had a £30,000 fine to raise money for. Henry resisted paying the fine. It was not an impossible amount of money for someone in his position to raise, but it's likely he hoped that the amount may be reduced.
A series of letters went back and forth in the 1610s between the Countess and the King, the Earl and the Queen, regarding the payment of the fine. Things were eventually settled. In 1613, after a lot of negotiating, the King accepted a payment of £11,000, just over a third of the original amount. The Wizard Earl, though, remained a prisoner in the Tower. The payment of the fine did not convince James to release him.
At first, the Earl was housed in the garden tower, but he soon asked for better accommodation, apparently because he was affected by the damp and the smells from the moat, but the fact that this was the tower in which his father had died must have been a factor.
He was then moved to the Martin Tower on the northeast corner of the Inner Ward, and it was here where most of his years as a prisoner were spent. In the Martin Tower, Henry had a great chamber, a drawing room, a study, a library, and 2 dining rooms, as well as accommodation for some of the 20 servants he had with him during his imprisonment. The rest were lodged in a house on Tower Hill. These rooms were all redecorated and refurnished, and the Earl paid for all this work.
He also rented the brick tower close to the jewel house for his son's use, so the Earl could personally oversee his education. He had a paved pathway built between the 2 towers, 50 years later, Samuel Pepys still called it my Lord of Northumberland's Walk. He used the time in the tower to pursue his studies, speak with scholars, and read some of his many books, which would regularly be brought to him from Zion. Lists of these books still exist in the Alnwick Castle archive. On average, he spent around £50 per year, £6,500 today, on books during his imprisonment, and a 19th century biography of Sir Walter Raleigh claimed Percy was ready to pay any sum for the company and conversation of men of genius.
Raleigh by this time was a fellow prisoner who joined the Wizard Earl in his studies and experiments. A contemporary writer claimed their prison was an academy where their thoughts were elevated above the common cares of life, where they explored science in all its pleasing forms and surveyed the whole globe.
Subjects of the books, written in English, French, Latin and Italian, included theology, philosophy, medicine, politics, history and the art of war. His collection also included astronomical and astrological volumes, herbal books detailing the natural and medicinal properties of plants, and the Bible of Geomancy, which taught readers to see the future through patterns created in soil or sand, a little like tea leaves. John Lingard's History of England, written in the Victorian period, said the Wizard Earl had converted this abode of misery into a temple of the muses.
He also practiced chemistry, alchemy, distilling, and other sciences. His reputation as the Wizard Earl was really confirmed during these years. De Fonblanc describes what it was like. Scholars and critics, alchemists and astrologers assembled in his rooms to discuss the theory of numbers and the law of optics, sunspots, and the satellites of Jupiter, to read and criticize the Fairy Queen in Sidney's Arcadia, to cast horoscopes, and to burn the midnight oil in the attempt to discover the secret of the transmutation of metals, perpetual motion, and the elixir of life. Many a time the sentinel beneath the Earl's window may have stood, startled and amazed, as strange and mysterious sounds fell upon his ear, the whirl of wheels, the monotonous click of many a pendulum, the crackling of unseen fires, and the solemn tones of incantation. The jailer indoors would gaze in awe upon his prisoner, as, clothed in quaint garments and inhaling through a tube the fumes of a burning weed, he sat with his familiars engaged in mysterious rites amidst curiously shaped instruments, retorts, alembics, and crucibles, zodiacal tables suspended from the walls, celestial globes slowly revolving upon their axes, automatic figures moving by some hidden power, and a human skeleton grasping an hourglass in its claw-like fingers. No wonder that strange rumours went abroad as to the dark practice of the Wizard Earl and his three magi.
The skeleton was provided by the Earl's medical attendant, Dr. Turner, who also gave him a pomander, a strongly perfumed ball to ward off plague. The three magi referenced here were Thomas Harriot, the astronomer, Walter Warner, a mathematician and scientist, and Robert Hughes, a geographer and also a mathematician.
For an annual payment of £100, around £13,000 today, to the Lieutenant of the Tower, the Earl was allowed to have his own cook and keep his own table for meals. These ended up costing over £1,400, that's £185,000 today, every year. Anne of Denmark, still sympathetic to Henry, occasionally sent delicacies from the royal table, and there are records of rewards paid to a servant who brought jellies from court.
While in the Tower, he had a wine cellar, a retinue of servants, and maintained stables on Tower Hill for the use of his family and visitors. He had a riding arena and horse training area constructed within the inner ward, and also built a bowling alley.
He attempted to manage his northern estates from the Tower, corresponding with various officers, including Robert Delaval, who wrote to him from Alnwick Castle. He supported the building and re-endowing of the Alnwick Grammar School in 1610, and wrote to the burgesses of Alnwick, the town officials, to offer to match funding for the school.
He played chess and draughts, had a table made for a game of military tactics with 300 small model soldiers, and owned a model warship, possibly for instructing his son Algernon in the art of war. He was also able to spend time fencing and playing tennis and battledore, a game which, in simple terms, involved two people hitting a shuttlecock backwards and forwards with a bat as many times as possible without it hitting the ground. For more on the Wizard Earl and other historical tennis players, listen to episode 43, The History of Tennis.
Once the fine had been paid, with no sign of a release from prison in his future, Henry seems to have tried to make life as luxurious as possible. His spending increased greatly in the later years he spent in the Tower of London. In 1615, his account for personal apparel, clothes, was more than £1,000, which is £130,000 today.
One account document, signed by the Earl and still in the castle archives, details more of his expenses whilst in the Tower. Payments range from those for haircuts and tobacco, for which the annual average payment during his imprisonment was more than £50, £6,500 today, to gambling and entertainment. Highlights include the following: to a man that brought the lions for his lordship to see them, given in reward to Tom Fool, given in reward to the blind harper that played before his lordship at the Tower, lost at play, for shuttlecocks for his lordship.
He also regularly gave rewards and donations to the people working in the Tower, as well as their families. On one occasion, the Lieutenant of the Tower's daughter received 2 pendant rubies as a gift from the Earl. He was considered so generous that when he was finally released, according to a letter written to Dudley Carleton, the warders of the Tower made great moan that they had lost such a benefactor.
Henry could not control everything from the Tower, however. The Countess of Northumberland continued to attend the Queen's court, taking their daughters, Dorothy and Lucy, with her. It was important for Dorothy and Lucy to have good marriages arranged for them, and the Earl, from prison, began negotiating with the father of Robert Sidney, the future Earl of Leicester, for Robert to marry Dorothy.
The two fathers didn't manage to reach an agreement, but the Countess, and probably Dorothy herself, were determined, so in 1616 the marriage happened privately, without the Earl's consent, and apparently without his knowledge. He was furious when he found out, and denied Dorothy her dowry. But in the face of a legal threat, in 1617 he gave in and paid £6,000, nearly £800,000 today.
Henry was, however, aware of the courtship of his younger daughter Lucy by James Hay, a favourite of King James and later Earl of Carlisle. Both Percy parents had a rare moment of agreement in their dislike of Hay. The Countess was eventually won over, but the Earl never was, even though Hay could have used his influence for the king to potentially free the Wizard Earl from the Tower. Henry could not bear the idea of his freedom being owed to a Scottish man, who would also end up being his son-in-law.
He tried to keep Lucy and Hay apart, actually ordering Lucy should keep him company in the Tower, adding withal that he was a Percy and could not endure that his daughter should dance any Scottish jigs. Lucy managed to arrange her way out of the Tower, and by the end of 1617 she was married to Hay. The king attended the wedding, while her father lay fuming in his prison. He refused to recognise his new son-in-law for a long time. When the idea of a quick release from prison was floated to him, he apparently told Lucy he would not accept freedom by means of the man she had degraded herself by marrying. Lucy, unlike her sister, never got her dowry, though it doesn't seem to have affected her rise to become one of the most important and influential women in the court of Charles I. For more of Lucy's story, please listen to episode 31 of the podcast.
The ninth Earl had more control over his son Algernon, who spent a great deal of time with his father in his schoolroom within the Tower, though he lived in the house on Tower Hill.
On the 6th of October 1615, the Earl wrote a letter to Algernon's tutor, Mr. Horsmanden, and detailed his opinion of his son as well as suggestions for his education. Among other things, he said, "To say anything of his virtues I will not, let them plead for themselves if he have any. His vices and defects are the subjects I must treat of, and what courses I would have him lean towards. Gladly would I make him an honest man in his own heart, a good instrument for his country, and able to manage that vocation he's born to with wisdom and comeliness. The defects of his person shows me his complexion to be pale and sallow, and that he's subject to abundance of moisture, yet more in his younger days than now, and as years and heat increase I find it diminished. The physicians differ not in opinion with me, and the greatest good I've found to him have been his wormwood beer, and sometimes this last year he's taken a stomachal pill an hour before supper, which I think has done him no harm, for since the use of it he's been very healthy, and not subject to headaches and castings as he was wont. For the defects of his mind, bashfulness is one of the greatest, which draweth on with it a silence till he be very well acquainted. Sparing he is in asking of questions, therefore must you study what he wants to know, and tell him, lest he prove a backward fruit, if he be not well manured. It will be long ere you understand what's in him, for you shall not find him much passionate of anything. This bashfulness is partly to be excused in him, for all our name are subject rather to few words than much babbling. For his studies, the perfect understanding of the Latin, a smack in the Greek if he be able to reach it, whereby he may make use of the terms of art, and his logic is the things I desire. His knowledge of rhetoric will follow, and a general insight into Aristotle's philosophy will not be amiss."
But when it came to marriage, Algernon followed his sister's examples and defied their father. The Wizard Earl was horrified in the late 1620s when 26-year-old Algernon became engaged to Lady Anne Cecil, granddaughter of his longtime political enemy Robert Cecil, who the Earl may have blamed for his long imprisonment. And having a dowry of £12,000, more than £1.4 million today, probably helped calm the Earl down.
The document Instructions to My Son, intended for Algernon and written in the Wizard Earl's later years, sees him offering a view on a variety of subjects.
Overall, the instructions tend to lean towards self-interest and lack of trust in others, as seen in the Earl's summary of the 3 key messages for successfully managing a large estate. These were: understand your estate generally better than any of your officers, make sure your gifts and rewards be your own without the intercession of others, and that you never suffer your wife to have power in the management of your affairs, because a wife can but be a woman subject to much weakness.
This dismissive attitude towards women, and Henry's disbelief in women's moral and intellectual abilities, is a key theme of Instructions to My Son. He also had a book in his library collection called Inferiorita della Donna, or The Inferiority of Women.
He claims, their wits are tempered as ours be, but, in general, their affections are founded upon what others do, and not what they themselves think is good, right, or wrong. If any do excel their fellows in matters of languages, as some ladies do, the Earl continues it is only good enough to make them able to entertain a stranger upon a hearth in a privy chamber. Besides, mark their conversation. In the most part it is but of nursery company, or, if extraordinary, they do converse with men, what will be their entertainments but to tell them they are fair, proper, witty, and pretty passages of flattering to gain their good wishes. Finally, he claims women are incapable of making progress in any learning saving in love, a little craft, and a little thriftiness.
These opinions, already inexcusable, are especially so considering the Earl grew up in the age of Elizabeth I and many other great women of history. The remarkable life of his daughter Lucy is even stronger proof of how completely wrong he was about the women of his own lifetime. Happily, the Wizard Earl's son Algernon appears to have ignored his father's instructions and was known as a loving and devoted husband.
At the beginning of the 1620s, the Wizard Earl was finally granted his release from the Tower of London, probably at the urging of his new son-in-law. Countess Dorothy did not live to see her husband's release that she had worked so hard for, dying before he was freed. Given his general misogynistic attitudes towards the capabilities of women, it is unlikely he fully appreciated what she had attempted to do on his behalf. But after the rocky start to their marriage, their relationship did seem to improve. A letter to Carleton notes that after her death, Henry's friends sometimes needed to remind the Earl of his former disputes with his wife in order to lessen his grief at her loss.
A condition of his release was that he had to stay within a certain radius of Petworth, his home in West Sussex, meaning he did not and could not visit Alnwick Castle or anywhere in the north again.
Though he did not attend Parliament again during King James's reign, he was kept informed of proceedings. When Charles I became king on James's death in 1625, Percy took his place in Parliament again, but only so he could oppose Charles and the new royal favourite, the Duke of Buckingham, who were attempting to override parliamentary rights.
The last decade of his life saw him stay mainly at Petworth, with occasional visits to London and Sion, and he spent some time each year with his daughter Dorothy and her husband at Penshurst in Kent. His last visit there was in the summer of 1632, just a few months before his death at the age of 68, which coincidentally occurred on the 5th of November.
Towards the end of his life, the Wizard Earl wrote about himself: I will say this much confidently and boldly, though not proudly nor arrogantly, for my defence. I was never extortioner, I never gained by oppression, I never sought any man's blood, and I was ever true to my prince and country, howsoever I might be mistaken.
The Wizard Earl was a complex man. He was proud and self-important, but also generous and charitable. He was a good patron to scientists and scholars, but arrogant towards women and other aristocrats. He was sometimes reserved and studious, and sometimes as hot-headed as his medieval Percy ancestors. But nearly 400 years after his death, he remains one of the most interesting characters in the history of Alnwick Castle.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this biography of the Wizard Earl of Northumberland. You can see his influence in various places if you visit Alnwick Castle in 2026. From his portrait in the dining room, to books in the library collection, to the alcove in Artisan's Courtyard, which was inspired by his experiments in science, alchemy and magic.
If you did enjoy this episode, please share the Alnwick Castle podcast with your friends and make sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.
We'll be back with another episode next month, and we'll be going back to an earlier part of the Tudor period.
We hope you'll join us for that, but until then, I've been Daniel.
And I've been Deborah.
Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.
Goodbye.